In this lesson, we'll examine strategies for tackling conclusion questions on the GMAT. These questions present us with a passage consisting of one or more premises, and the answer choices consist of possible conclusions. Your job is to identify a conclusion that follows logically from the premises. Now, how do we recognize a conclusion question? As always, the question stem will tell us. Here are some examples of question stems that indicate a conclusion question. The statements above, if true, most strongly support which of the following conclusions? If the statements above are true, which of the following must also be true on the basis of them? Which of the following hypotheses receives the strongest support from the given information? And which of the following can be logically inferred based on the statements above? Notice that all of these questions are essentially asking us to identify something that must follow from the premises. Also note that when a question stem asks you to make an inference based on the given premises, this is the same as asking you to draw a conclusion based on the given premises. So an inference question is the same as a conclusion question. Now, before we examine the strategy for tackling conclusion questions, it's important that you understand the difference between the type of conclusion you typically find when you're given an entire argument and the type of conclusion that you must draw in a conclusion question. Now, when we're given an argument, say in a weaken the argument question, the degree to which the conclusion follows from the premises varies, and in most cases the conclusion is only partially supported by the premises. For example, a given argument might say something like this. For the past 3 days, all of Florida's orange farms have experienced freezing temperatures. Therefore, the number of oranges harvested this year will be less than expected. Notice that the conclusion in this argument, while somewhat supported, is not absolutely guaranteed. In other words, we cannot be 100% certain that the harvest will be less than expected. So for most arguments on the GMAT, it's okay if the conclusion is only partially supported by the premises. In fact, there are many GMAT questions that require you to strengthen or evaluate arguments, so it would be difficult to do so if those arguments were always perfect. However, when a critical reasoning question asks you to find a conclusion, that question is asking you to find a conclusion that must absolutely follow from the premises. Consider this example. For the past 3 days, the temperature at every Florida orange farm has not exceeded -5 degrees Celsius. The statement above, if true, most strongly supports which of the following conclusions? So given this information, what's a possible conclusion here? Well, what about the number of oranges harvested this year will be less than expected? Can we conclude this with 100% certainty? No, we cannot. So this would not be the correct answer choice. Remember that when it comes to conclusion questions, the conclusion must be guaranteed by the premises. So what kind of conclusion is guaranteed here? Well, what about the orange harvest at some Florida orange farms will be less than expected? Can we conclude this with absolute certainty? No, we cannot make this conclusion with any certainty, so this cannot be the correct answer. Let's try one more. How about at least one orange will be damaged from the freezing temperatures? Can we conclude this with absolute certainty? No, we cannot even conclude this. Sure, it seems very likely that at least one orange will be damaged, but the given premise does not guarantee that this will happen. Now, once we understand the degree of certainty required by a conclusion question, this question type becomes much easier to handle. So what would be a logical conclusion here? Well, one logical conclusion would be, for the past 3 days, not one Florida orange farm has experienced temperatures above -5 degrees Celsius. This conclusion is guaranteed by the premise. In fact, it's just a rewording of the premise, but it could be a correct answer. Or we could make the conclusion that, during the past 3 days, at least one Florida orange farm has experienced temperatures lower than 40 degrees Celsius. Now notice how unimpressive this conclusion is. The premise tells us that the temperatures at every orange farm were lower than -5 degrees. But this conclusion states that at least one farm had temperatures less than 40 degrees. Nevertheless, this conclusion is guaranteed by the premise, so it could be a correct answer. So the big takeaway here is that conclusion questions require you to find a conclusion that must follow 100% from the premises. Any conclusion that might follow, or could possibly follow, or even will likely follow, cannot be the correct answer. Okay, so now let's examine the strategy for solving conclusion questions. Our first step will be to identify and summarize the given premises. The next step, if at all possible, is to draw your own conclusion from the given premises. Just remember to draw a conclusion that must follow from the premises. Now this is an important step, because if you're able to draw the correct conclusion before checking the answer choices, then you need only identify that conclusion among the answer choices. This is much faster than determining whether or not each answer choice is the correct answer. So if you're able to draw a logical conclusion, the next step is to look for an answer choice that matches your conclusion. Now, if you're unable to draw a conclusion, or if you don't spot your conclusion among the answer choices, then you need to be somewhat aggressive in eliminating incorrect answer choices so that you can find the correct answer. So as you check each answer choice, ask, must this be true? And do not allow yourself to consider any answer choices that are sometimes true or could be true. Remember that you're looking for a conclusion that is guaranteed by the premises. Now, another strategy to consider is to apply a version of the negation technique that we learned in the lesson for assumption questions. To do this, negate each remaining answer choice. The negated conclusion that contradicts the premises the most is probably the correct answer. And finally, as always, be sure to check all answer choices. Okay, so that's the basic strategy for handling conclusion questions. Now let's examine some additional tips to consider as you follow these steps. The first tip to consider is this. When drawing your own conclusions, do not stray too far from the premises. Keep it simple. Remember that you are not required to draw an earth-shattering Nobel Prize winning conclusion. All you need to do is identify a conclusion that must follow 100% from the premises. On a similar note, as you're checking each answer choice, be sure to watch out for an answer choice that is simply a rewording of one of the premises. For example, consider these two premises. Kyle enjoys chocolate, and Rome is the capital of Italy. What is a logical conclusion that one could draw from these premises? Now, the mistake that students typically make is attempting to combine all of the premises in order to draw a conclusion. This approach can get you in trouble. Keep in mind that a conclusion question will never ask you what conclusion can be drawn using every premise. So you're under no obligation to use every premise. So, for example, a perfectly valid conclusion here would be something like, the capital of Italy is Rome. From the premises, this conclusion must be true. While it's not exactly an interesting conclusion, it would be a valid answer. Okay, continuing with additional tips to consider, we should add that conclusions need not involve every premise. We just saw this in the last example. Another consideration is to not inject assumptions into arguments. Every assumption that is necessary to draw the conclusion must be explicitly stated in the premises. Also, when checking the answer choices, beware of answer choices that introduce new ideas or new words. If you see a key word in the conclusion that was not mentioned in the premises, then that answer choice is probably not correct. And finally, beware of answer choices where the strength of the language does not match the strength of the language in the given premises. For example, if the premises contain words indicating uncertainty, such as perhaps, sometimes, and maybe, then a forceful conclusion with strong words, such as always and must, cannot be the correct answer. Okay, so those are some additional tips to consider. Now let's summarize. In this lesson, we learned the strategy for solving conclusion questions.